He saved the albino Apache woman at midnight. By sunrise, her mother claimed his ranch. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now let's dive into the tale. On a cold, moonless night, when the wind howled across the barren plains, a solitary rancher named Thomas Campbell found himself in the midst of a situation that would forever change his life. Thomas, a man of few words and even fewer friends, lived alone on his sprawling ranch in the desert of Arizona. For years, his only companions were his cattle and the wide, empty expanse of land that stretched endlessly around him. But that night, everything would change. As Thomas sat by the warmth of a crackling fire, he heard a faint, desperate cry coming from the direction of the nearby cliffs. Without thinking, he grabbed his rifle and his coat, rushing out into the cold night to investigate. The wind whipped his face, making it hard to see, but the sound of the cry cut through the air, unmistakable. It was the sound of someone in need of help. As he reached the edge of the cliffs, he saw her, an albino Apache woman, barely conscious, her body bruised and battered. She lay on the cold ground, shivering, her clothes torn from what had clearly been a violent encounter. Thomas, without hesitation, rushed to her side. His heart pounded as he checked her wounds, praying she was still alive. Her skin was pale, almost ghostly, a stark contrast to the dark night surrounding them. Her hair, long and wild, hung loosely over her face, hiding her features. He gently pulled her into his arms, lifting her with surprising ease despite the cold and the exhaustion settling in his bones. He carried her back to his cabin, his mind racing with questions. Who was she? Why was she out here alone? And who had done this to her? Thomas laid her down on his bed, wrapping her in warm blankets, trying to stem the blood that soaked through her torn clothes. As he worked, the woman stirred, her eyes flickering open for a brief moment. Her gaze met his, filled with fear and confusion, but she couldn't speak. Her lips trembled, as if she was trying to form words, but no sound came out. Thomas whispered softly, assuring her she was safe now. He stayed by her side through the night, watching over her as she drifted in and out of consciousness. The hours passed slowly, the storm outside only adding to the tension in the air. By morning, the woman had fallen into a deep sleep, her breathing steady, though she remained unconscious. Thomas didn't know what to expect when she woke, but something told him that her presence here, on his land, would bring a storm far worse than the one outside. He had no idea that by sunrise, her mother, one of the most feared figures in the Apache tribe, would arrive at his door, claiming his ranch as her own. Little did Thomas know, saving this woman's life would not only put him in the path of danger, but would also alter the course of his future forever. The sun was just beginning to rise over the vast desert, casting a warm glow across the rugged terrain. Inside the small cabin, Thomas Campbell sat in a chair, his eyes fixed on the fire that still burned low in the hearth. The woman he had saved from the cliffs the previous night lay on his bed, her breathing steady but shallow. He had spent the entire night keeping vigil, unsure of what would happen next, but his mind was filled with a deep sense of unease. As the first light of dawn crept through the cracks in the wooden walls, he heard a sound outside that made his heart race. Hooves, steady and determined, approached the cabin. He stood up quickly, his hand instinctively reaching for the rifle that hung on the wall. He didn't know who it could be, but he had a sinking feeling that the woman's past was about to catch up with them. He moved cautiously toward the door, peeking through a crack in the wood to see what lay outside. A small group of riders had arrived, their faces hidden beneath the hoods of their cloaks. They were Apache, he could tell by the way they moved and the symbols painted on their faces. The leader of the group, a tall and imposing figure, stepped forward and dismounted. Thomas felt a chill run down his spine as the man's eyes locked onto his. Without a word, the leader gestured for his men to stay back as he walked toward the cabin. Thomas hesitated for a moment, unsure of how to handle the situation. He had no idea what these people wanted, but he knew one thing for sure. They were not here for a friendly visit. The man reached the door and knocked sharply, the sound echoing in the stillness of the morning. Thomas took a deep breath and opened the door, his heart pounding in his chest. The leader of the Apache tribe stood tall before him, his expression unreadable. He studied Thomas for a long moment before speaking. "You saved my daughter," he said, his voice low and steady. "And for that, you have my gratitude." Thomas was taken aback by the man's words. He hadn't expected such a formal greeting, but he was still unsure of what was coming next. "I only did what anyone would have done," Thomas replied, his voice betraying his uncertainty. "She was hurt. I couldn't just leave her out there to die." The Apache leader nodded slowly, as if considering his words carefully. "You are a good man," he said finally. "But you are also a man who has made a decision that will have consequences." Thomas frowned, his confusion deepening. "What do you mean?" The leader's eyes flickered toward the window, where the woman still lay in the bed, unconscious. "My daughter," he said, his voice growing colder. "She is not just any woman. She is the daughter of a chief, and her survival here means more than you can understand." Thomas was about to speak when the leader raised his hand, silencing him. "You have shown her kindness, but that kindness has brought with it a debt, and that debt must be paid." Thomas's stomach twisted in knots. He had no idea what kind of debt the man was talking about, but it was clear that it was something he couldn't avoid. "I didn't ask for this," Thomas said, his voice rising with a mixture of frustration and fear. "I just helped her. I don't want anything in return." The leader's gaze hardened. "That is where you are wrong, my friend. You may not have asked for this, but you have become part of something far larger than yourself." He paused for a moment, his eyes narrowing as he looked at Thomas. "My daughter's survival has not gone unnoticed. There are those who will come to collect what is owed." A sense of dread washed over Thomas as he realized what the leader was implying. "What do you want from me?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. The Apache leader stepped back, his eyes filled with a mixture of respect and finality. "What is owed to us," he said softly, "is your land." Thomas felt as though the ground had been ripped out from beneath him. His heart raced, his palms sweaty as the words echoed in his mind. The Apache leader turned on his heel and signaled for his men to move. As they rode off into the distance, Thomas stood frozen in the doorway, his mind reeling. The woman he had saved was now the key to a debt he didn't even know he had incurred. And as the sun climbed higher in the sky, he knew that the events of the past few hours were only the beginning of a much larger story that would unfold in the days to come. The sun had risen high in the sky, casting long shadows across the ranch as Thomas Campbell stood in front of the door, his thoughts racing. The Apache leader's words echoed in his mind, and despite his best efforts to shake them off, he could not. His land was at risk. A debt he didn't even know existed was now looming over him, and with it, a sense of dread. He had spent his life working the ranch, building it from the ground up, and now, it felt like it was slipping away. Thomas paced back and forth outside the cabin, his mind working through every possibility. He had saved the woman, hadn't he? What did it mean that her survival now carried such a heavy price? What had he really agreed to when he decided to help her? The woman, he still hadn't learned her name, lay unconscious inside, her body finally starting to heal from the brutal beating she had endured. Thomas had been careful with her, tending to her wounds as best as he could, but there was a lingering sense of unease. Who were these people that had arrived in the dead of night? Why had they been hunting her? As he walked toward the barn, his thoughts were interrupted by the distant sound of hooves. His heart skipped a beat as he turned, already knowing who it was. The Apache riders had returned. This time, they weren't alone. A group of them had gathered just outside the ranch, their dark figures silhouetted against the sun. Thomas knew there was no point in hiding. They were here, and whatever was coming next, he would have to face it. The leader of the group dismounted first, his eyes fixed on Thomas with an intensity that sent a chill down his spine. He was a tall man, his skin darkened by the sun, his face carved with the marks of a warrior. His presence alone was enough to make Thomas feel small. "You are a brave man," the leader said, his voice low and firm. "But there are things you do not understand." Thomas nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. "I saved her. I did what anyone would have done," he said, his voice trembling slightly. The leader stepped closer, his gaze never leaving Thomas. "You do not know who she is," he said quietly, almost as if speaking to himself. "She is more than just a woman. She is the daughter of the Apache chief, and her survival here means much more than you realize. Thomas's stomach twisted. I didn't know, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't know she was important. The leader's eyes softened for a brief moment, but his words were still heavy. You are caught in the middle of something much bigger than you. What you've done will have consequences, but it's not too late to make things right. Thomas's heart raced. He had no idea what this man was asking him to do, but he knew one thing for sure. His life was about to change forever. What do you want from me? Thomas asked, his voice shaking with a mixture of fear and determination. The leader stared at him for a long moment before speaking. You will return what you have taken, he said, his voice steady but filled with authority. Thomas's confusion deepened. What are you talking about? He asked, his mind racing. You took something from us when you saved her. The leader continued. You took away a part of our honor, a part of our land, and now it must be returned. Thomas felt a cold sweat form on the back of his neck. I didn't take anything, he said, his voice firm now. I saved a life. That's all. The leader's gaze hardened. You saved a life, yes. But that life was never yours to save. With that, he turned and walked back toward the riders, his footsteps leaving a trail of dust behind him. You have one day, the leader called over his shoulder. By the time the sun sets, you must make your choice. The Apache will not wait forever. The words hung in the air like a heavy storm cloud. As the riders mounted their horses and rode off into the distance, Thomas stood frozen in place, his mind spinning. What choice was he being given? How could he return something he didn't even know he had taken? He glanced back toward the cabin, where the woman still lay. He had saved her, but now, it seemed like that act of kindness had set off a chain of events that would force him to choose between his land, his future, and the people he had never imagined he would become entangled with. The day stretched out before him, heavy with uncertainty, and as the sun began to climb higher in the sky, Thomas knew that by sunset, his life would never be the same. The day stretched on, and Thomas could feel the weight of the decision pressing down on him. His heart was heavy as he stood outside his cabin, staring at the vast land that he had worked so hard to build. The sun was high in the sky now, casting long shadows across the dry earth, but his mind was elsewhere. He had never imagined his life would take such a turn. One moment, he had been a simple rancher, and the next, he found himself caught in the middle of a world he had never understood. The Apache people had arrived, and with them came a debt he hadn't known he had incurred. The leader's words echoed in his mind. You took something from us when you saved her. But what had he taken? All he had done was help a woman in need. She had been hurt, left to die in the cold, and he had simply done what anyone would have done. And yet, now, he was being asked to return something that he didn't even know existed. As the hours passed, the pressure grew. He had one day, one single day, to make his decision. And it wasn't just about the land. It wasn't even about the woman who lay unconscious inside his cabin. It was about something deeper, something that went beyond property lines and debts. It was about honor, about the bonds between people, and about the choices that defined a man. The sound of hooves in the distance snapped him out of his thoughts. He turned quickly, his heart racing. This time, the riders were not Apache. They were the men from the nearby town, the ones who had been watching his ranch for months, waiting for an opportunity to claim it as their own. Thomas had known this day would come. He had always known that the land he had worked for so long would one day be taken from him. But he hadn't expected it to come like this. The riders approached, their faces grim. At their head was Marshal Voss, the local lawman, who had never had much love for Thomas. We've been patient, Voss said, his voice cold. But your debts are long overdue. You need to pay up, or we'll take this place from you. Thomas stood tall, his jaw set. He had faced worse threats in his life. He had fought for everything he had, and he wasn't about to give up without a fight. I don't have the money, he said, his voice steady. But this land is mine. I've worked it, I've built it, and I'm not giving it up. Voss's expression hardened. You don't have a choice. You've got a debt to pay. Either you pay it, or we take the land, and everything you've worked for will be gone. The other men dismounted and spread out, surrounding the ranch as if they were already claiming it. Thomas's eyes flickered toward the cabin, where the woman lay. His mind raced. He had no way of paying these men, and they knew it. They would take the ranch, and there would be nothing he could do about it. But then, as if on cue, the sound of more hooves filled the air. Thomas turned sharply, his eyes widening as he saw a group of Apache riders approaching from the horizon. The leader from earlier was at the front, his expression unreadable. He rode toward Thomas, his eyes locking onto Voss. "You are here for the land," the Apache leader said, his voice firm. "But it is not yours to take." Voss's eyes narrowed as he looked at the Apache riders. "This is none of your business. Get out of here, or we'll have to deal with you too." The Apache leader did not flinch. "You will not take this land," he said, his tone unwavering. "It belongs to the Apache now, as it has for centuries, and we will defend it." Voss sneered, clearly not intimidated. "You and your people can't stop us. This land is already under our control. The law is on our side." The Apache leader's eyes flickered to Thomas, and for the first time, there was a hint of understanding in his gaze. "The debt has been paid," the leader said. "The land is yours." Voss's face twisted with anger. "What are you talking about?" he demanded. "This man owes us. He can't just get away with it." The Apache leader's voice was low but firm. "The debt was paid when he saved our daughter. He took nothing. He gave everything. And now, we claim what is ours." The words hit Thomas like a tidal wave, and for the first time in hours, he felt a sense of relief wash over him. The Apache had returned the favor, and in doing so, they had given him something more valuable than he could ever have imagined. His land, his future, was safe. As the Apache riders stood tall, facing down the men from the town, Thomas knew that this was not the end. It was only the beginning of a new chapter in his life, one where honor, debt, and survival would be tested in ways he had never expected. The sun was setting over the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. The dusty ranch had been eerily quiet since the Apache riders left. Thomas stood at the edge of his land, watching the fading light and feeling a strange mix of relief and confusion. His life had been turned upside down in the past few days. The Apache leader's words still echoed in his mind. "The debt has been paid. The land is yours." But what did that really mean? He couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning, not the end. He had been spared the loss of his land, but something bigger was at play. The Apache tribe had shown him kindness, but it was not without strings attached. The land he had fought for and worked so hard to build now seemed to carry a weight far heavier than before. As the last rays of sunlight dipped below the horizon, Thomas walked back to the cabin. He pushed open the door and looked at the woman who lay in the bed, still unconscious. She was his saving grace, the reason he still had his land. But who was she really? What was her connection to all of this? And what did her mother, the Apache chief, expect in return for their protection? Thomas sat down in the chair next to the bed, his gaze fixed on her peaceful face. Her skin was still pale, but the bruises had started to fade. He reached out and gently brushed a strand of hair from her face, his mind racing with questions. He had saved her life, but what did that mean for him now? Was he part of their world now? Was he part of the Apache story, whether he wanted to be or not? Just as he was lost in thought, the woman stirred. Her eyes fluttered open, and she slowly looked around the room. She didn't speak at first, just took in her surroundings, and then her gaze fell on Thomas. "You saved me," she said quietly, her voice weak but filled with gratitude. Thomas nodded. "I couldn't let you die out there." She nodded slowly, her eyes filling with emotion. "I know, and for that, I will be forever grateful." Thomas opened his mouth to respond, but stopped himself. What could he say? What did he want from her? He had already given everything he had, and now he was left wondering what the future held. Before he could speak, the woman shifted slightly in the bed, her movements slow but deliberate. "My mother will come for you," she said softly. Thomas's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" She looked at him, her eyes dark with the weight of something unspoken. "She will ask for something in return. The debt is not fully paid." Thomas stood up, his pulse quickening. "What does she want?" The woman took a deep breath, as if gathering the strength to speak. "She wants more than just your land. She wants your allegiance. She wants you to join the Apache, to fight with us. Your fate is tied to ours now." The words hit Thomas like a punch to the gut. He had known that his act of kindness would have consequences, but this was more than he had bargained for. He had saved her life, and now, it seemed, he was bound to something much larger than he could have ever imagined. "I don't know if I can do that," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've spent my life building this ranch. I can't just leave it behind." The woman's gaze softened. "I understand. But you must make a choice. You cannot have both. The Apache will not allow it. Thomas's mind raced. How had his life come to this? How had a simple act of saving a life led him to the brink of a decision that would change everything? He had always been a man of the land, a man who believed in hard work and independence. But now, the land he had fought for seemed to be slipping through his fingers. He looked down at the woman, her expression filled with a mixture of sadness and understanding. She had given him a chance at something he never expected, but now he was faced with a choice that could destroy everything he had built. I need time to think, Thomas said, his voice rough with emotion. I don't know what the right thing to do is. The woman nodded slowly, as if she had already expected this. Take all the time you need. But know this, the Apache do not wait forever. The choice will be made for you, whether you are ready or not. With that, she closed her eyes and drifted back into a restless sleep, leaving Thomas alone with his thoughts. As the night grew darker and the wind howled outside, Thomas stood by the window, his mind filled with doubt and fear. The Apache were powerful, and they had given him a chance, but at what cost? His land, his future, and his very identity were now at the mercy of forces he didn't fully understand. And as the moon rose high in the sky, Thomas knew that his decision would come soon, and it would shape the rest of his life. The next morning, Thomas stood at the edge of his ranch, watching the first light of dawn creep over the horizon. The wind had calmed, and the land was still, almost eerily so. The calm was a stark contrast to the storm brewing inside his chest. He had barely slept, his mind torn between the choices laid before him. The Apache had come, and with them, a debt he hadn't known existed. But it was more than just the land that was at stake now. It was his future, his identity, and his sense of who he was. The woman he had saved, the albino Apache, still lay unconscious inside his cabin. Her mother, the chief, had already made her intentions clear. Thomas was to choose between the life he knew and a future bound to the Apache people. It was a choice he wasn't sure he could make. He had worked his entire life to build this ranch, this land, and now it seemed like it was slipping through his fingers. But there was another part of him that couldn't deny the pull of the Apache's offer. The idea of belonging to something greater than himself, of standing alongside a people who had fought for their survival, was a powerful one. Thomas had always been a solitary man, a man of the land. But in this moment, he realized he couldn't do this alone anymore. The Apache had given him a choice, but that choice had come at a cost. As the sun rose higher, Thomas knew it was time to make his decision. He turned and walked back toward the cabin, where the woman lay. He had to face her, face the reality of what his actions had set in motion. He had saved her life, but now the consequences were unfolding, and he could no longer hide from them. The woman stirred as he entered, her eyes opening slowly. She looked at him, her gaze still clouded with confusion, but there was something in her eyes now, something deeper, more knowing. I have to ask you, Thomas said, his voice rough. What does your mother want from me? What is this debt that I have to pay? She took a deep breath, her face tightening. As she processed his words, my mother wants what is owed, she said softly. But it is not just land. It is loyalty. She believes in the strength of our people, in the bond that binds us all. She wants you to stand with us, to fight for us. Thomas swallowed hard. He hadn't expected that. But I'm not Apache, he said, his voice faltering. I don't belong to your tribe. The woman's eyes softened. It is not about blood, she said. It is about what you choose to become. You have already shown the strength of character, the courage, to help someone in need. My mother sees that. She believes you have the heart of a warrior. Thomas stepped back, his mind racing. A warrior? He had never thought of himself that way. He had always been just a rancher, a man of the land, nothing more. But now, with the weight of the Apache people's expectations resting on his shoulders, he wasn't sure what to think anymore. He had always prided himself on his independence, on his ability to live alone, to rely on no one but himself. But the Apache were offering him something different. They were offering him a place in their world, a chance to fight for something greater than himself. It was a tempting offer, one that tugged at something deep inside him. He had saved her life, and now, in some strange way, he felt as though he was being pulled into a life that was not his own. The woman watched him closely, her expression unreadable. You must decide, she said softly. You cannot have both. You cannot hold on to this land and reject the bond my people offer. My mother's decision will be final." Thomas nodded, his heart heavy with the weight of his decision. He had always been a man of the land, a man who believed in hard work and perseverance. But now, he was faced with something that challenged everything he had ever known. He had always believed that a man's worth was measured by his ability to build, to create, to own. But the Apache saw strength in something else: loyalty, honor, and the willingness to fight for those who could not fight for themselves. He turned and walked toward the door, his heart pounding in his chest. He needed time to think, to clear his mind. He had made his choice once before when he saved her. But now, he was being asked to make a choice that would shape the rest of his life. And as he stepped outside, the wind picking up once again, he knew that the time for decisions had come. The Apache were waiting, and his future hung in the balance. As the days passed, the weight of Thomas's decision grew heavier. He spent most of his time walking the vast stretches of his ranch, the land he had poured his blood, sweat, and tears into, unsure of what direction his life was headed. The sun burned down on the dry earth, and the wind kicked up dust, but no amount of weather could wash away the questions swirling in his mind. The Apache had given him a choice. His land, his future, was in their hands now, and he didn't know how to make sense of it. It had been days since the Apache leader and his riders left, leaving him with an ultimatum. Thomas couldn't stop thinking about the woman he had saved. She was still inside his cabin, recovering, and Thomas hadn't seen her move or speak much. The thought of her mother, the Apache chief, looming over his fate, haunted him. The choices felt impossible. Could he really leave the life he had built, the only life he knew, to join a people whose customs, culture, and way of life were so different from his own? Or would he stay, fight to keep the land, and risk everything he'd worked for? He had always believed in hard work and self-reliance, but now he was being asked to put that aside. The idea of belonging to a group, of being part of something greater than himself, was both alluring and terrifying. On the morning of the 7th day, just as the sun was beginning to rise, Thomas made his decision. He walked back to the cabin, his heart heavy with uncertainty, but his mind finally set. He had to face the Apache chief. He couldn't avoid this any longer. The woman he had saved had made it clear that her mother would not wait forever. She was going to come for him, and when she did, the debt would be paid. He had no idea what the future would hold, but he had to stand and face the consequences of his actions. The woman was sitting by the window when Thomas entered the cabin. Her eyes met his, and for the first time, there was a hint of understanding in them. She could see it in his eyes. The decision had been made. She nodded silently, as if she knew what he was about to say. "I will go," Thomas said, his voice steady but filled with a deep, unspoken sorrow. "I can't keep this land if it means turning my back on everything I've learned in the past few days. I can't walk away from the Apache, from what they stand for. But I'm not sure what that means for me." She looked at him, her eyes full of gratitude. "It means you've chosen honor over ownership. You've chosen something bigger than yourself." Thomas swallowed hard, the weight of her words settling on him. He had never thought of it that way. In his mind, the decision had been simple: keep the land or leave it. But now, as he looked at her, he realized that the choice was never about the land. It was about the kind of man he wanted to be. The woman stood up slowly, still weak but stronger than she had been when he first found her. "I will tell my mother," she said quietly. "But there is one thing you must understand. The Apache do not forgive betrayal. If you go back on your word, if you go back on your promise, there will be no place for you among us. The land will be lost, and so will you." Thomas nodded. He had already made his promise. There was no turning back now. "I will keep my word," he said, his voice firm. She smiled faintly, then walked to the door. "I'll tell them," she said softly, her voice filled with a quiet strength. "The Apache will know of your choice. And when my mother comes, we will see what happens next." As she left the cabin, Thomas stood still, the silence enveloping him like a heavy blanket. His mind was made up, but his heart felt heavy. He had no idea what the future would bring, but he knew one thing for certain. He would never be the same man again. The decision had been made. He had chosen a path, and now he would have to follow it, no matter where it led. As he walked outside and stood on the land he had worked so hard to build, he felt a sense of finality. The Apache were coming, and with them came a new chapter in his life. He was no longer just a rancher. He was a man with a debt to repay. And as the wind picked up and the first rays of the sun broke through the clouds, Thomas Campbell realized that the future, whatever it held, was now in his hands. The day passed slowly as Thomas waited for the Apache to arrive. The air was thick with tension, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. His heart was heavy, but his mind was clear. There was no turning back now. He had chosen the path of honor, but he could not shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of something far larger than he had ever imagined. The sun was setting as the first riders appeared on the horizon. They rode in silence, their horses moving in perfect harmony, their eyes fixed on the ranch. The woman he had saved was beside him, her presence a quiet reminder of the choice he had made. As the riders drew closer, Thomas took a deep breath and walked toward them. The leader of the group, the same man who had spoken to him before, rode ahead, his eyes locking onto Thomas's. The man dismounted, his boots hitting the ground with a thud that seemed to echo through the silence. He approached Thomas slowly, his gaze unwavering. "You have kept your word," the leader said, his voice deep and steady. "And for that, you have earned our respect." Thomas nodded, the words hanging in the air like a weight. "I didn't do it for respect," he replied. "I did it because it was the right thing to do." The leader studied him for a moment before speaking again. "You are a man of honor," he said. "But honor alone will not protect you. The Apache have many enemies. And now, you are one of us. That makes you a target." Thomas felt a shiver run down his spine. He had known this wasn't going to be easy, but the weight of the reality hit him harder than he expected. "What does that mean?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "It means," the leader said, his eyes narrowing, "that you are now part of the Apache. And as such, you will fight for us, as we will fight for you. But we do not forget those who would harm us. You have earned our trust, but it must be proven in battle." Thomas swallowed hard, his thoughts racing. He had never imagined his life would lead him to this point. He had always been a rancher, a man of the land, but now he was being asked to fight for a people he barely understood, to protect a land that was no longer his alone. The leader extended his hand. "Will you join us, Thomas Campbell? Will you fight for the Apache, for your new family?" Thomas looked down at the outstretched hand, the question hanging in the air. He had never been one to shy away from a fight, but this was different. This wasn't just about defending his land. It was about defending a people, a way of life. He thought of his ranch, his home, and the life he had built. It was all he had ever known. But now, as he stood here, in the presence of the Apache, he realized that life was no longer just his own. He had made a choice, and that choice had consequences. He took the leader's hand. "I will fight for you," he said, his voice steady. "I will stand with you, whatever comes." The leader nodded, his face softening for the first time. "You have made the right choice. The Apache will remember your loyalty. But know this, once you stand with us, there is no turning back. Your old life is gone. You are one of us now." Thomas nodded. He understood. The Apache weren't asking for his loyalty just for the sake of loyalty. They were asking for his commitment to a cause, one that went beyond land or personal gain. It was a cause that was about survival, about fighting for the future of a people who had been pushed to the brink of extinction. As the riders dismounted and gathered around, Thomas felt a strange sense of peace settle over him. He had made his choice, and now, he would fight for something bigger than himself. The Apache were his family now, and they would protect him as he would protect them. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting a final golden light across the desert. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of the earth and the promise of what was to come. Thomas stood tall, his heart filled with resolve. The future was uncertain, but one thing was clear. He was no longer just a rancher. He was a man of honor, a man who would fight for the Apache, for the land, and for the future. As the Apache chief raised his hand, signaling for the others to gather, Thomas felt the weight of the moment settle in. He had made his choice, and now, there was no turning back. The days that followed were a blur of preparation and uncertainty. Thomas, now fully part of the Apache tribe, spent his days training with the warriors, learning their ways and customs. The bond between him and the Apache people deepened as they worked together to defend the land that had been his and now was shared between them. The life he had known as a rancher slowly faded into the background, replaced by something larger than himself. Yet, even as he grew into his new role, the old life still tugged at him. Every time he walked the land, his heart ached at the thought of what he had left behind. The smell of the earth, the wide open spaces, the cattle grazing peacefully. These were the things he had built his life around. But now, as a warrior of the Apache, he knew he could never go back to the solitude he once craved. His life was now bound to the tribe, and with it came a responsibility to fight for something more than just his own survival. The final test came one fateful morning when the Apache chief called upon all the warriors to defend their land. A band of hostile settlers had arrived, threatening to take the land by force, believing that their claim was stronger than the Apaches. They had no idea what they were up against. Thomas stood beside the Apache warriors, his heart pounding in his chest. He had never fought in a battle like this before, but he had learned quickly. His rifle felt heavy in his hands, but he held it with steady determination. This was the moment that would define him, the moment when his loyalty to the Apache people would be tested in the most profound way. As the settlers approached, Thomas and the other warriors mounted their horses, ready for the fight. The air was thick with tension, the silence before the storm. Then, with a single command, the Apache chief led the charge, and the battle began. The sound of hooves pounding the earth, the clash of weapons, the cries of the warriors, it was chaos. Thomas fought alongside them, his body moving on instinct, the lessons he had learned coming to the forefront. He fought with all his strength, determined to protect the land he had sworn to defend. The battle raged on for hours, but the Apache were strong, their warriors fierce and skilled. By the time the sun began to set, the settlers had been driven back, their plans thwarted. Thomas stood among the Apache, his chest heaving with exertion, his hands bloodied but his spirit unbroken. They had won, but the cost had been high. Many had fallen, and the scars of the battle would remain with them for the rest of their lives. As the tribe gathered around their fallen comrades, the Apache chief approached Thomas, his face filled with respect. "You have proven yourself," the chief said, his voice filled with pride. "You fought with honor, with strength. You are one of us now, in heart as well as in blood." Thomas felt a lump form in his throat as the weight of the chief's words sank in. He had not just defended the land. He had earned his place among the Apache. The man he had once been, the rancher who worked the land alone, was gone. In his place stood a warrior, a protector of the Apache people. The future was uncertain, but for the first time, Thomas felt a sense of belonging, a sense of purpose. As he looked around at the Apache warriors, his new family, he knew that this was where he was meant to be. This was the life he had chosen, and he would fight for it, no matter the cost. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the land. The battle was over, but the fight was far from finished. There would always be more battles to fight, more challenges to overcome. But Thomas was ready. He had found his place in the world, and with the Apache by his side, he knew he could face anything that came his way. The days of solitude were behind him, and the future, though uncertain, was filled with the promise of strength, loyalty, and the bonds that tied him to the Apache people. As the fires burned brightly that night, the sounds of laughter and songs filled the air. The Apache had won, and with that victory came a new beginning. Thomas had come a long way from the lonely rancher he once was, and now, as he sat among the tribe, he knew that this was just the beginning of his true journey.